Hello, this is Teresa. I'm back with a new card tutorial video. I'm going to show you some cards made with dies and paper from Dare to be Artsy. So I'm using this background die, which is very detailed. I'm using a couple of word dies. One of them is the word happy, which you can use both the positive and negative space after die cutting. And I have the shadow as well as the detailed birthday word. So the first thing I'm going to do on this card is I'm going to do a die cut of that background glued directly down on a piece of cardstock, the exact same color. And this is just one of two ways to add some texture to the background of the card. And I'm using my Create a Max sticker maker in order to apply adhesive. A couple of other alternatives would be a spray adhesive, or if you have the patience to do it, you can add liquid adhesive to the back of the die cut. It's just whatever preferred method you have. So as you can see, I just pulled the backing paper away from one side of it, and I'm going to remove it by peeling it back and then pressing down on the die cut as I move across. And for any excess adhesive that I have left, I'm going to use this adhesive eraser to remove that residue from the die cut before moving on to the next step. So now I have a textured background created from just using two layers. Since I've already cut the shadow, I've cut it from the back of this pattern paper, and I will have links below to the products that are used today. I've die cut the birthday word from black cardstock, and I'm going to be using the positive letters from that happy word die cut out, but I will also be using the negative in order to line that up. Now before I get to this happy word, I'm going to add some liquid adhesive on the back of my black die cut and then add it to the shadow that I cut out of the stripe pattern paper. And another fun thing about this is a good way, as you'll see in a little bit, to use up scrap pieces of paper. So what I did before I put this together is I looked through all my scraps to find some coordinating colors that would match that striped paper. And I'll be creating the balloons out of those little scraps, as well as one from the pattern paper. So after adding liquid adhesive, I'm gluing on that black die cut onto the stripe pattern background, and that's going to form part of the sentiment for the front of the card. And now that I have that ready, I'm going to trim around my background for the card. I'm trimming very close to the edge of the die cut on top, but leaving a little bit of a margin all the way around. So by the time I get done with this, it will be slightly smaller than a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch panel. Now what I'm doing here is I'm grabbing the negative space and taking the letters and popping them back into that space so that I'll be able to adhere them down on the front of the card, and they will be lined up, and that will make the process a lot easier. So this die gets you double duty. And on my second card, I'll be using the negative space for the sentiment. So I have a piece of Post-it tape right here that I used to pick up the entire piece. And the thing I will be doing on the happy word is adding liquid adhesive on just the die cut letters, and doing my best to avoid any of that negative die space. Before doing that, just gluing down the birthday die cut word. And I'm going to use my Zig 2-way pen because I can kind of just dab using the corner of the pen and just dab at the letters. So just moving along, making sure to avoid getting that background so that when I glue it down, just the letters will remain, and I'll be able to peel up the remaining negative space. So I'm just placing that down on the card front, And I pressed down on the tape, held it for a bit, and attempted to peel it up, and it wasn't sticking, so I put a little more pressure, waited a little bit longer, tried it again, and it was still coming up. So I decided to try slightly different tack to this after it wasn't peeling up. I started from the opposite edge and then put my thumbnail down on the edge of the paper, and as I peel it back, I'm just pressing down the entire piece as I peel away that post-it tape. And then I'll grab a corner of that negative space, and I had to use my little pen blade to do that. It made it a little bit easier to do this. And as I slowly pulled up that edge, my letters remained in place and they're lined up just the way they need to be. So this is where I use scrap paper to cut a few different balloons, and I also cut them 3 times out of white paper. The reason I'm doing that is I want that to be my highlight on each of the balloons. So I'll just basically turn it the opposite direction on the back of the colored piece of paper, and that will fill in that die cut area at the top that's there for that highlight. So I'm cutting off the little balloon ends because when you turn the die the other way around, the part at the bottom of the balloon is not exactly the same shape, so that just makes sure you don't see an odd shape sticking out because of the white die cut behind. And my idea here was to wrap the twine around and use some tape just to adhere it to the back of the colored cardstock, and then that way it looks like it's tied around the base of the balloon. So once I did that, I add some liquid adhesive, and I'm going to use one of the white die cuts and make sure it's turned the opposite direction, and then press that onto the back of the balloon, making sure that piece of twine is pulled out straight from the bottom, so by the time you turn it around, the string looks like it is tied onto the bottom and is in place. And after trimming this, I'll do the exact same thing on the other balloons, but I just did that part off camera. So now I'm moving on to placement of the balloons on the front of the card, and I got an idea of where I wanted them to be, and I grabbed a small piece of twine and just tied that in a simple, not quite knot, but just pulled it. And as you could see, I kind of had to fuss with this a little bit. It probably would have been a lot easier if I had just cut a longer piece of twine, but I stuck with it until I got that little knot tied, and then I'm trimming off the edge or each of the ends so that it's a bit shorter. And now that that's done, I'm going to grab my liquid adhesive glue again and glue down each of the balloons. And pretty much after doing this part, the only other part I will be gluing down is just where I tied that little knot earlier, so that it doesn't cover up the sentiment that I already have on here. So I put a block there just temporarily just to hold that in place. And as a finishing touch, I'm using some Morning Dew Nuvo drops because they dry crystal clear. And at first I was trying to coat the entire surface just by squeezing it directly out of the bottle. And after I did that first balloon, I decided it would probably be a lot simpler if I just put down some of the Nuvo on top of the next balloon, and then I used my finger to spread it out so it would be thinner coat overall, and that way it would dry a little bit faster. And by the time it dries, it's going to give me a nice glossy finish on all the balloons. And if you wanted to take it a step further, you could do this also with the sentiment to make that part shiny. I didn't do that on this particular card, but that's another option that you can do. And so there's the first card. Now moving on to the second card, I'm using the same background die on a nice teal colored cardstock, and I'm going to make sure that it is lined up, not right at the edge, but pretty close to that top edge. And then after I do the next step, I'll be trimming this down. So I'm setting this sandwich up on my Big Shot so that I can emboss. So I'm putting down a base plate on my extended platform with all tabs open. I put the die cut facing up. I put the embossing mat, that tan mat, and then the black mat, not mat, but pad on top of that. That's one of the things that you can buy with a Big Shot. And by doing it this way, instead of cutting through your cardstock, you're going to end up with a embossed look for your background. And you just want to be kind of careful when you're pulling this apart. I accidentally tore my paper, but I managed to cover that up on the finished card just by placement of the sentiment. So I've trimmed down that teal cardstock so it lines up right where the embossed edges are, so that I'll have a frame on it when I put it against this black A2 card base. And now I've glued on some silver embossed. Well, what I meant to say is I die cut from silver mirror cardstock to create the sentiment on the second card. So I thank you for joining me today. If you have not before, please consider subscribing to this channel and leave me a thumbs up or a comment to let me know what you think about today's video. Thank you very much for watching.